It was coming in. The speed of the water was unbelievable.
For Māori population, our transition was completely different, even though we're two populations living side by side.
The bill is structured to facilitate polarisation. It's structured to facilitate anger, hatred, fear, resentment and division.
One of the arguments that's come out with the Coote situation this week is that this all just seems a bit too convenient, and the recreational drug video, let's call it that, the timing of that coming out is a bit suspicious.
Welcome to the Weekly Wrap, where we go over the top video stories from the past week. First up, MBR visits businesses on the front line of Cyclone Gabrielle to assess damage, loss of life, recovery and future growth nearly 2 years on. Here's a sneak peek at what's available to read and watch on mbr.co.nz. Nearly 2 years after Cyclone Gabrielle ripped through New Zealand with multiple casualties, the aftermath is still visible in Hawke's Bay.
It was coming in. The speed of the water was unbelievable.
The cyclone remains vivid in the minds of those who lived through it.
By about 6 p.m. on the Monday night, rain was starting to impact at that point. Pretty severe winds, I remember. I was driving home at about 6 o'clock.
If we were sitting here on February the 15th, Jonathan, we'd have our heads just above water.
This is a typical spring day here in Hawke's Bay, but almost 2 years ago, conditions were vastly different. We're in Hawke's Bay to check in with businesses directly affected by Cyclone Gabrielle. We'll assess the impact on business as well as the human toll as the typically sunny coastline went pitch black. In those early days, it was a matter of life or death. Communication was down and Napier and Hastings were cut off. Businesses on the front line stepped into action.
When I woke up, by the time I ran up, got the kids up, it was coming in the house. We had to climb through the boot of our car. It was over waist deep. Within 2 minutes, we're gaining over a metre of water in a couple of minutes, so we were lucky to get out.
Cam Taylor is from family-owned apple grower Taylor Corporation. He, along with his pilot, used his company's helicopter to help people trapped by the rising floodwaters.
We accommodate about 190 RSE workers from the islands, so that was my first thing was getting them. We airlifted them. They were all on stop banks or hills, so we're just doing short flights, moving them to safety, and then we just carried on going up the river, and that's when we realised that we're in, the region's in big trouble. It's your community, it's your neighbours, it's your farmers, so I knew 50-60% of them, so it was pretty, some of them, you had to take control, real strong actions just to, and some just needed a cuddle. For me, what we saved, over 150 people, so yes, there was people we couldn't save, but hey, if I wasn't there, so, I think the community all got together. There was people in small inflatable boats and jet skis, so the community, I get asked, you weren't trained for this, but being in the horticulture and farming and you're with machinery, you're used to doing these sort of things. Well, sort of. But yeah, it was devastating basically. So we were in the air for four days, sort of flying people.
Cyclone Gabrielle put immense pressure on bridges in Hawke's Bay. This one behind me in Pakawai was destroyed completely. Air Napier stepped into action to deliver essentials from early on.
We were moving newspapers, we were moving money for the Reserve Bank because, again, up in Gisborne, the ATMs ran out of cash, so that created a lot of economic but also social issues. And, our team didn't have experience managing C-130s or big Hercs, and, with the help of the Air Force staff, our guys pitched in as well, and they managed that. So you learn a lot about your own skill set. You also learn about a lot that when it is emergency times, no task is too big or too small. You just kind of get in and do a lot of that stuff.
Like Cam Taylor with his helicopter, the regional airline also transported vulnerable people, including pregnant mums and doctors in those early days.
Everything we went through, none of us probably expected it. We've got some experienced staff, but for most of them it was the first time ever, including myself, dealing with a natural disaster at this scale. And anywhere from making our terminal the home of the Defence Force for the next 2 weeks, where we saw up to about 72 movements of various aircraft, offloading stock, food, milk powder, diapers for babies, water bottles, all the way to generators, Starlinks, ATM machines. We moved a total of about 2,000 passengers in that 2-week period. I think it was total 6 pregnant mums who came down to Napier with us. And, we were fortunate to fly them back with their little wee ones back up to Wairoa in a safe manner. So, look, it was pretty intense. And I think in the moment you don't really realize what you're doing and where, things are going to come out. But 2 weeks later, when I think the emergency was removed and, you kind of hear the scale of devastation, and as you talk to people, you realize that you were a small cog to it, but a very important one.
We had, over 700 mils of water came over the height of the stock bank and essentially flooded the site with nearly 1.8 to 2 metres of silty water. I think we had over 100 vehicles on the site, including 22 logging trucks that were parked on the site that night, completely destroyed. Well, not physically destroyed, but not recoverable.
Paper and pulp processor, Panpac, is facing a repair and replacement bill upwards of $300 million. The old stock bank also needs to be built higher.
The way it's working out, either Panpac or some other funding mechanism will be required to pay the increase in the stock bank capacity for the residential section.
And does that feed into what you're looking at, a $300 million bill?
No, that's on top of that.
Can you put a rough guesstimate on what that sort of cost might be?
That's in the order of sort of 4 to 5 million. Yeah.
And you can do that?
We have to. Without that stock bank in place, getting reinsurance for flood for this site, giving the shareholder confidence to continue investing, and giving our employees confidence that this is a good place to put effort into on a continuous basis. It's really important.
And head to mbr.co.nz for more as we explore the response and recovery from Cyclone Gabrielle in Hawke's Bay. While the world's populations age, New Zealand's changing demography offers a unique edge. Our Aotearoa Māori editor Mike McRoberts asks, can we harness this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity before it's too late?
The Hikoi mō te tiriti provided a strong sense of Māoridom's disapproval of the Treaty Principles Bill and other government policies. But also on show were some other indisputable facts. The Māori population is youthful and it's getting bigger. Māori now number nearly 1 million, around a fifth of New Zealand's population. And as Professor of Demography Dr. Tahu Kukutai tells me, it's a far cry from 150 years ago.
When you think about back to the 1890s and then even the earlier 20th century, and the rates of mortality in Māori communities were stark. There was a time where people were sort of preparing to smooth the dying polo of the Māori race. To get to nearly 1 million Māori in Aotearoa in 2023, that is a major change.
So how did that change come about? Quite simply, Māori have had, and continue to have, more babies than European origin New Zealanders.
For Māori population, our transition was completely different, even though we're two populations living side by side. You know, if you think about the age structures like triangles, which a lot of people are familiar with, that's the shape of youth. And the Māori population and the Pacific populations are still sort of triangle-like in terms of being quite structurally youthful. The Pākehā population, it's not like a triangle, it's more like a kind of like a sausage, and that is a much older population. So we've got a sausage and a triangle side by side in Aotearoa, and the interaction of the sausage and the triangle is going to have long-term ramifications for everything, our economy, our society, our decision making. So Aotearoa now in the next 20 years looks nothing like Aotearoa the 1950s, the 1960s, the 1970s. It's a very different future.
Unlike many developed nations, New Zealand has a distinctive demographic advantage, a youthful Māori population prepared to fill future workforce gaps.
We don't see that in Australia. We don't see that in Canada. We don't see that in the US or the Scandinavian, countries. Like 20% of the national population is Māori now, and that's just going to increase. In some regions, it's up to 60%, and if you took the tamariki population, you're talking about 80% of the region's tamariki population are Māori. That time to invest is actually now. It is now, and it's difficult to do that with migrants. Often they will come with their own set of skills and their own set of work experiences, but we can invest strategically and in a very planned way in our local workforce.
This opportunity, often called the demographic dividend, refers to the benefits that arise when a large working age population supports fewer dependents, pre-working age and retirees. But as Dr. Kukutai warns, the window to seize this moment is closing fast.
With population, we know how this is going to play out. It's largely irreversible. Once population momentum starts, you can't turn off the switch and change it. It just doesn't work like that. So there's going to be this moment in time where the population is going to look a certain way. And you don't want to wait until that's upon you. You want to plan for that strategically, so you invest in those cohorts so that when they get to that point in time, you're really firing on all engines. Your economic engine room is firing because you've done the prior investments required to make sure that those cohorts are well skilled when they move into the workforce. And if you don't take that window, then it's lost. It doesn't come back around again.
9-week-old Rango Kaehi will be part of that next generation workforce. His mum Roy and dad Te Kura are confident his immersion in Te Ao Māori is his future.
Are you speaking to the to him?
Yes, yeah. That's all we speak to him, is Māori. Because for us, we believe that he'll learn English as he goes out into the world, but if at home he has his reo, then he'll know who he is and he'll be able to walk through the world and, be proud to be a Māori, a young Māori boy. So our home is predominantly Te Reo Māori to him and between ourselves.
So you feel confident of Te Ao Māori future for him?
Absolutely. I believe that's all he'll know growing up, especially living on the doorstep of his papakainga just up the road, and also being a hui goer, so he went to his first wānanga at 2 weeks, so it's definitely going to be his whole entire lifestyle, and that's how we'll raise him.
Roy Kapia is part of an emerging young Māori leadership. She's 27, has her own content creation company, and is a trustee board member for Ngāti Whātua Ōrākei. She says being in the position she is allows others of her and younger generations to see what they can do as well.
We fail as leaders if we aren't working on succession planning and bringing up our younger people to fill these seats and knowing that they're going to be okay when you decide to step aside, And if, I guess, you can be a part of that, bringing people in, educating them, helping them through that process, you know that everything's going to be okay. So yeah, it's a beautiful shift that we're seeing.
And there was no more prominent example of that succession planning than when Ngāwai Honoi Te Pō was named the new Māori Queen, following her father's death in September. She is the second youngest Māori monarch appointed to the role, and at 27 years, she represents the median age of the Māori population.
There's that pithy thing like, they're our future, mokopuna are our future, but they literally are. And now we have a leader who really embodies that in a really tangible way.
And others, like 22-year-old Te Pāti Māori MP, Hana Rāwhiti Maipi Clark, part of the cohort known as the Kohanga generation, who are unapologetically Māori.
I think there's definitely a growing recognition within Te Ao Māori that there is power and opportunity in having a young population. I'm hearing that now as a demographer in ways that I never did.
Really? How?
10 years ago. People say to me all the time, we've got a really young population, isn't that wonderful when we've got higher fertility? Well, I mean, our fertility is just on replacement and it's dipping below. It's not the fertility of our nannies. You know, no one has 16 kids anymore living in a 2-bedroom house, you know. Not many, not to the extent that they used to. You know, what it means for distributional models, what it means for iwi-led investment, you know, and right through to things like, you know, what kinds of areas do we want to actively promote our rangatahi to go into.
Dr Kukutai says for New Zealand to make the most of the potential demographic dividend from a youthful Māori and Pacifica population, investment needs to come from across Aotearoa.
Is that happening? I mean, you just need to look at the statistics to see that that's not happening in, in a meaningful and planned way. Part of that's ideological too. I mean, I think, you know, there's a fairly significant, section of the community that still sees brown kids as a problem to be solved, not as a, solution, to put it in a crude sense, to some of our woes and some of our future workforce needs. You know, there's a real resistance to that acknowledgement that Māori and Pacific tamariki and rangatahi are actually going to be significant parts of our future economy.
A well-known whakatauki or Māori proverb, ka pu te ruha, ka hao tō rangatahi, speaks of the old net being cast aside as the new net goes fishing, a net that one day might be needed to feed a nation.
It's not just a Māori issue. It's not just a Pacific issue. Actually, it's our future workforce issue. So we should be heavily invested in that. And it doesn't really make sense to have this binary, us and them. Actually, it matters for all of Aotearoa. And I think employers who get that, who can make that shift, make that mental shift, and see it that way, will be in a much stronger place because they'll think about their future workforce differently, not just from sort of like an EDI perspective, but actually from a demographically driven economic planning perspective.
Labour Party leader Chris Hipkins is adamant the Treaty Principles Bill is divisive and will do New Zealand no good. Our political editor Brent Edwards sat down with Hipkins. Stick around to hear what he had to say.
Labour Party leader Chris Hipkins says the Treaty Principles Bill is a lightning rod for racism. He joins me now. How?
Oh, well, ultimately, it's an open invitation to everybody who has a racist view in New Zealand to come forth and share that with everybody else. This bill will drive a wedge between New Zealanders. It's not the sort of conversation that's going to draw us together. If David Seymour wanted to have a constructive conversation about the future of the treaty and where it sits within New Zealand's constitutional framework, I think there's a lot of Kiwis who would be up for that conversation. That's not what he's doing here. A conversation involves listening as well as talking. David Seymour seems to think you can have a conversation where he's the only one who gets to talk.
He says, if you look at the principle, it's all about just equality.
It simply isn't. I mean, it's based on a lie. His whole bill is based on a lie. That lie being that Māori somehow have special privilege and special treatment. Actually, all of the evidence, all of the facts, all of the statistics show otherwise. Māori don't live as long. They have worse health outcomes, worse educational outcomes, more likely to end up in prison. In the employment, they're more likely to be unemployed. They've got a higher unemployment rate, more likely to earn less when they are in paid employment. All of the statistics suggest that actually Māori, far from being privileged, are the opposite. So a government taking proactive action to ensure that we are more equal, that Māori do have access to opportunities that they've previously been denied, I think that's a really positive thing.
Because at the hikoi, roughly 35,000 people, I think, a massive crowd, turned up to Parliament to oppose the bill, but also I think opposed to a range of other initiatives that the government's been taking. And I think you made a comment to say that perhaps people thought Labor went too far one way, but now they're thinking this government's going too far the other way. What do you mean by that?
I think if you look at that crowd that was out there today, there were a lot of non-Māori in the crowd. So there were a lot of other New Zealanders there. There were a lot of white New Zealanders, Pākehā New Zealanders like me. There were a lot of Māori New Zealanders, of course, a lot of Pacific people, a lot of migrants, all in the crowd saying, actually, we think this government's going too far. Now, even if people thought, and there are certainly some people who thought that in areas like the water reform,
co-governance,
co-governance in particular, which became a sort of a contested concept, unfortunately, in a way that I think was very unhelpful. People who were uncomfortable and thought we'd gone too far there, largely based on misinformation that was spread about that, I might add, they now look at this government and say, oh no, but this is going far too far in the other direction. So things like, rewriting the school curriculum, effectively writing Māori out of the school curriculum, telling government departments they can't use Te Reo Māori anymore when it's the first language of this country, disestablishing the Māori Health Authority, which basically is a by Māori for Māori approach to delivery of healthcare. I think there's a lot of non-Māori New Zealanders who look at those things and think this is going too far.
I mean, there's always been political debate around this, but I guess for the last decade or more, maybe there was a sense that there was generally multi-party or certainly general bipartisan agreement between National and Labor over the approach to the treaty issues. Has that broken apart?
Well, I think if you go back, there were notable exceptions. So Don Brash's, Aotearoa speech certainly fractured that. That what was, I think, at that point, even up to that point, had been sort of an emerging consensus, but it came back together again. So John Key, Bill English, Christopher Finlayson, Hekia Parata. You can name the figures in the Key government. I think actually did a lot to repair the damage that was done by Don Brash in his Aotearoa speech in terms of the National Party's relationship with Māori, because if you go back prior to Don Brash, I think people like Jenny Shipley, Jim Bolger, Doug Graham, they actually had a good relationship with Māori and they worked hard on that and there was goodwill, and I think that Don Brash sort of broke that. But I think that what this government have done has gone even further than that. Don Brash was just, an opposition politician at that point. He wasn't actually exercising the levers of power. This is a government doing this. So this is a government, using the power of the Crown to promote something which no government in New Zealand has tried to promote in my lifetime, which is quite a divisive agenda when it comes to all things Māori.
So what would a future Labor government do on issues of this nature? What would you, in terms of what this government's scrapping, what would you bring back? Where would you sort of pitch it?
Well, I think we do need to focus on bringing people together, and that does mean explaining what we're doing. And I said before the election, I think in some of those areas we didn't explain what we were doing. So co-governance became this sort of buzzword for everything that people thought we were doing in this space that they didn't like. When actually co-governance is nothing to be threatened by. And in fact, most of the co-governance arrangements relating to Māori that are currently in place were put in place under national governments, not Labor governments. And I don't think there's anything there to be scared of, but it became this kind of buzzword that was thrown against us as a bad thing. And I think we didn't take enough time to really push back on that and to explain what we were doing and why we were doing it. That we were balancing a range of rights and interests. As previous governments have done both poorly and slightly better on issues like the foreshore and seabed, for example. So there are always going to be contentious issues in this area, but I think we have to focus on trying to bring people together in those debates, have those conversations in a constructive way, and one that's not top down. I think that's the other thing that we've got to recognise, that democracy around the world and here in New Zealand is increasingly being eroded by public scepticism towards the institutions of government. And it's because for the last 50, 60, 70 years, democracy's kind of drifted towards a top-down model. And democracy doesn't have to be like that. Democracy can be much more grassroots up. And I think one of the challenges for the democratic institutions here in New Zealand and around the world is, if we want to preserve democracy, if we still think that this fragile thing called democracy is the best way forward, we're going to have to restore public faith in it. Because around the world, you see that public faith in democracy is really, really fraying.
Well, how about the debate over the next few months on the Treaty Principles Bill? It's going to select committee, it's the committee open for submissions. Obviously likely to hear oral submissions late January through February. Are you comfortable or confident that that debate will be a reasoned one?
I don't think it'll be a reasoned debate, because the bill's not structured to facilitate a reasoned debate. The bill is structured to facilitate polarisation. It's structured to facilitate anger, hatred, fear, resentment and division. That's exactly how David Seymour has structured it, because that's what he thinks is best for his political interests. This isn't about a constructive debate about the future of this country. It's about seeding division for political gain.
But we all know too that select committee is going to report back and say, get rid of the bill.
That's right. And look, the sooner it does that, the better, as far as I'm concerned. The longer this debate goes on, the more David Seymour will get exactly what he wants, which is to divide the country, to polarise the country, and to, open a Pandora's box that will be very, very hard to close again.
Well, that select committee, and its report on the submissions, says it intends to finish the submissions, hearing the submissions by the end of February. Is that quick enough?
Oh, the sooner the better, as far as I'm concerned. But, I'd be quite happy for them to report the bill back next week. We could vote it down and be done with it before Christmas. And then it won't be hanging over everyone, into the new year.
Do you accept the Prime Minister's argument, though, that he doesn't like the bill, but that's the price of MMP?
To be honest, that's a weak and pathetic argument by Christopher Luxon. He could have said to David Seymour during the coalition negotiations, no, this is a bottom line for us. We're not going to do it. We think it will be divisive. We think it will be a distraction, and we're not going to agree to it. David Seymour wouldn't have walked away from the government based on that alone. I think that's just absolute posturing on the part of both of them.
You've also made a comment about Labor, how it's changed in 20 years, because obviously foreshore and seabed, for instance. I mean, what's happened with Labor in terms of your approach then, since then?
Well, almost everybody who was in the Labor team during the foreshore and seabed debate no longer is. But I think we've got to learn from that experience. I think we stopped talking to each other. The last huge gathering out the front of Parliament, akin to the one we saw today, was over the foreshore and seabed. It was actually smaller than the one we saw today. The one we saw today was much, much bigger. And I think it is a sign, you do have to take notice of these things. And I think the previous Labor government was navigating some really, again, divisive territory and didn't get it right. And I think even Michael Cullen, I think even at the the end acknowledged that they didn't get that right, and he was the one who was trying to stitch it all together for the government. But it was, again, I think the National Party had a role to play there. You had Bill English and Don Brash whipping up fear over foreshore and seabed, and the previous Labor government, I think, did become very wedged by that issue.
Drugs and drunken rants. UK Premier League referee David Coote's suspension after damaging video circulated on social media raises issues about an employer's right to suspend for out-of-work misconduct. Senior journalist Fiona Rotherham has the latest in this week's Toil and Trouble.
Toil and Trouble this week looks at the case of UK football referee David Coote, who's been suspended for a foul-mouthed rant about former Liverpool manager Jurgen Klopp. That came just before video footage emerged of Coote sniffing allegedly white powder in a hotel at Euro 24 where he'd been a match official. And joining me now to discuss how employers deal with this sort of issue in the workplace is Jeremy Ansell, Senior Associate at Duncan Cottrell. Welcome, Jeremy. Can you give us the background on what happened with David Coote?
Hi, Fiona. Yes, this is an extraordinary story that's come out of the UK in the last week or so. So, as you mentioned in your intro, there's a football referee called David Coote. He's employed by a body called PGMOL, Professional Game and Match Officials Body, who employ all these referees to preside over Premier League fixtures. It's a very high-profile league and a very high-profile role. He's continually in the public spotlight. And as you've mentioned, out of nowhere really, and only a couple of days after he'd refereed a relatively high-profile fixture, a video surfaced on X platform showing him quite inebriated, it appears, alongside a friend, making quite derogatory and disparaging comments about the then Liverpool manager, Jurgen Klopp. And this is a video that has allegedly been filmed in 2020. And subsequent to that, another video came out showing him potentially snorting a substance while or very close to being involved in VAR duties at the Euro 2024 tournament that's just been. So all of that has brought into focus in the UK in relation to this matter, all sorts of issues to do with the employer's right to suspend. What can an employer do about out-of-work misconduct or serious misconduct that's discovered, as the case may be, and conflict of interest type scenarios. So it's a really fascinating story that's come out.
Can employers take disciplinary action for what an employee does in virtually their own time?
The short answer is yes, you can, if there's a connection between the alleged misconduct or serious misconduct and the employee's role. So take the Coote example, as I mentioned, very, very high profile role. Also somebody there who has an obligation of neutrality and impartiality. The refereeing role is taken very, very seriously in the UK. The referees basically have to declare any allegiances. If they support a particular side, they're not allowed to referee that side or any of their rivals. So there's a whole body of roles in place. And what you've got with that example is somebody making a whole lot of comments that are in a negative light about that particular club. He even finished by saying he hated Scousers, which is a term referring to people from that area of England. So because of that type of conduct, there's a clear connection there, right, between the out-of-work conduct and his role as a referee, and it brings him to question whether he's even capable of performing his duties in his role.
What's the law on suspension here in New Zealand then? What would happen in the New Zealand scenario?
Yeah, so Coote's been suspended by PGMOL in the UK, and I understand that was done with a little bit of consultation straight away. And it's much the same here. Where our case law has gotten to with suspension is that some degree of consultation is required. So it doesn't matter if you discover what appears to be the most egregious form of conduct in the world, you know, for example, a video on X or something really damaging. Under New Zealand law, an employer is still required to go and go and consult with the employee on the prospect of suspension. So you've got to go and say, this is what we've discovered, it appears to be serious, and this is the reason why we're proposing to suspend you. It may be because it brings into question whether you're able to discharge your duties, or it may impact on the reputation of the employer. And you basically have to get their feedback on the prospect of suspension before confirming the suspension. It seems a little silly in a way because no employee is ever going to say, yes, I think it's a wonderful idea that you go ahead and suspend me from my duties. But the employer still does need to test that out, because there will be some circumstances where suspension might not be appropriate. The alleged conduct is, for example, it might be a driving offence or something, and if the employee has a role that doesn't involve driving, there's no real need for them to be suspended, then the employer might struggle to justify that.
I guess employees might say, hey, I thought this was in a private setting. I didn't know someone was filming, for example, in Coote's case.
Absolutely. And it brings into question, I think, the issue that we're seeing more and more of in the social media world, and that's doxing, because one of the arguments that's come out with the Coote situation this week is that this all just seems a bit too convenient, and the recreational drug video, let's call it that, the timing of that coming out is a bit suspicious. So there perhaps is an element there of somebody having it in for this individual and sequentially releasing information. So there's something that doesn't sit quite right about that, but it also doesn't excuse the conduct. And the fact of the matter is the employees put themselves in that situation, in an incredibly difficult situation, by allowing themselves to be filmed saying silly stuff in a way that conflicts with their role. So a real legal conundrum there.
Are conflict of interest clauses common in New Zealand?
Yes, they are. They're in a lot of employment agreements that we see. So, and that can be a couple of obligations there. One is to avoid creating basically a conflict of interest scenario, as David Coote has done with issues of neutrality. You might remember a couple of years ago, or maybe earlier last year, there was the Rob Campbell example. He was the board chair at Aotearoa, and he created a conflict scenario there by making quite politically loaded comments about National Party policy at the time. So your obligations as an employee will be not to do anything that creates a conflict of interest, but it's also to disclose any potential conflicts that you might have, because often, even if it doesn't end up being an actual conflict, often the perception of you having a particular conflict is every bit as important as whether you actually have one or not. And if you at least disclose those potential conflicts, you let your employer decide whether it's an issue or not. So don't do anything that gives rise to a conflict. If you already have one, disclose it so it can be dealt with. Those are the fundamental obligations.
And just finally, Jeremy, what do you think will happen with Coote?
Well, he's suspended, as I mentioned, for quite some time. This actually happened with another referee in England many years ago. That referee was caught in a video making disparaging comments about disabled people, which I think is significantly worse than what we've seen here. That employee was eventually allowed to return. So the body over there will have to do a full and thorough investigation. It may take quite some time. I mean, he certainly can't referee Liverpool fixtures going forward, and it remains to be seen whether he'll be allowed to return. But as it sort of appears now, it could be the end of his career.
Thanks again for joining us. Our news team is back from 5 a.m. tomorrow with the latest business news you can use on mbr.co.nz, and join Mike McRoberts from 5:30 p.m. tomorrow for a look at the day's top stories. See you next week.